Welcome to this week's edition of Journalist Roundtable. I'm Francine Schertzer. Our guests this week are Aliya Schneider, reporter for the Philadelphia Inquirer, John Finnerty, managing editor for CapitolWire and State Affairs, and Justin Sweitzer, managing editor for City and State PA. Thank you all for joining us. Justin, I'd like to start with you. The federal government officially shut down on Wednesday. What impact is this going to have on Pennsylvania?
I think we're already hearing a lot of federal agencies talk about furloughs. And so you might see that at certain levels, depending on what department you interact with. But a lot of, essential employees are continuing to work. I know, IRS, other federal agencies, who are deemed essential are still going to be, on the job, making sure certain essential functions continue. So I think I think we'll see how this plays out over the coming weeks. There's a lot of blame shifting going on right now between Republicans and Democrats. So, I don't think we know how long this could drag out for. But, I think there could be some blips depending on what federal agencies you're working with. But, if you need tax help, I believe, national parks, some national parks will stay open this time around. So, it doesn't seem like it'll be a broad, complete, interruption like it could be. So, I think we're going to have to see how it stretches out.
Aliya, I know you've been covering this issue as well. What are your impressions of how Pennsylvania might be impacted by the shutdown?
I think right now it's a lot of confusion. President Donald Trump has kind of been threatening different projects in various states. And I cover Pennsylvania and New Jersey. And I know I saw something on X about a project being threatened in New Jersey. And when I reached out to their governor's office, they didn't have any more details than what I saw by looking at the post on X. So I think really right now we're seeing kind of the president trying to put pressure on Democrats by threatening different projects in various states. And the information is a little unclear right now exactly what that looks like.
Justin just mentioned a moment ago about the potential for layoffs. Aliya, to what extent do you expect those federal worker layoffs to become permanent?
Again, I honestly don't know. I mean, I think a lot of this is politics, and a lot of it is kind of the president doing things and blaming the Democrats for not passing the budget bill and saying, we have to do these layoffs because of XYZ. We know the president has also wanted layoffs otherwise. So I feel like a lot is getting convoluted in between what was actually something that the president wanted to do versus something that's kind of being thrown in as part of the politicking around the government shutdown. So I wish I knew the answer. I don't know. But I do think it's all kind of part of this broader political game in a way, almost.
U.S. Senator John Fetterman voted along with the Republicans to attempt to reopen the federal government. Why did he do so, and how are his colleagues perceiving him at this point?
Was that a question for me?
Yeah, Aliya, go ahead, please.
Oh, I'm sorry. I think Senator Fetterman has been comfortable voting, to the beat of his own drum, not necessarily what all his other colleagues are doing. He's been someone who's been willing to work across the aisle. I think I haven't personally reported on the senator's decision for this, so I don't want to say too much, but just as someone who's covered Senator Fetterman, I know that he is someone who's willing to kind of do his own thing that he feels is right, even if it means siding with Republicans and not kind of going along with what the Democrats are doing. And that's something that he's gotten praise for from Republicans and something he's been criticized for by Democrats. And I think that's kind of something that goes for and against Senator Fetterman as a politician. He's someone who's willing to, work across the aisle. And sometimes that is appreciated, but sometimes that does kind of exacerbate, tensions with members of his own party.
And I think Fetterman's sort of evolution is a reflection of Pennsylvania right now. You look at, we truly are a very purple state right now, where you look at, in terms of voter registration and the active, among active voters, you're down to it's like a $40,000 40,000 difference between Democrats and Republicans now, which, 10, 15 years ago, it was more like 700, 800,000. And, right now, Fetterman is as popular among Republicans as he is Democrats. So I think, maybe this is just part of his positioning himself. If he can fend off whatever primary challenge might come, he feels comfortable being a man of all of Pennsylvania at this point.
While we're in the midst of the federal shutdown, we're also still over 3 months beyond deadline for the state budget. John, you've been covering that. Can you talk a little bit about who's starting to feel the impact of that delay?
Sure. I mean, we're seeing a little more now. It was kind of weird over the summer where it was awful quiet. We went months of reporters staring at each other and saying, years ago there'd be people protesting here, and all summer it was very quiet. But school districts are starting to complain a little bit. County governments, the county governments and the school boards came out on Tuesday, I think, and we're talking about how every year, when there's an impasse, if they have to pay their bills, if they run out of money, they got to borrow money to keep the lights on. And at the end of the day, when the state passes their budget, they don't get reimbursed for all the costs that are associated with borrowing. So that's come up. The rape crisis centers are expressing concern. Some of these small nonprofit agencies that do a lot of the actual work on the ground are struggling at this point. We do have both the House and Senate coming back next week. The Senate has, in saying they're coming back, they said they're coming back to effectuate the budget. So that's a big word, but I hope it means something. House is going to be there. It's been very quiet about whether or not, why they're both there. We have had a couple times over the last couple of months where there have been rumblings that, we're close and then it falls apart. Right now, they're coming into town and there's been very little chatter about sort of how close they are. So maybe that's good news. Maybe that's the old, we're getting close, so people are shutting up,
The governor's original budget ask was, I believe, to borrow $1.5 or $1.6 billion from the Rainy Day Fund. Justin, you wrote a nice explainer about what the Rainy Day Fund is. Can you just explain briefly for our viewers what the Rainy Day Fund is and maybe some of the pros and cons of whether or not lawmakers would be willing to borrow from that?
Yeah, essentially it's the state's piggy bank. It's formerly known as the Budget Stabilization Reserve Fund. And, at the end of each fiscal year, over the last several years, the state has been depositing, surplus money into the account. And, this has helped the state's credit rating. The belief around the Rainy Day Fund is it's there for a rainy day. It's there for when something bad happens. And I think over the last several years, whether it's the COVID-19 pandemic or something else, we've always heard arguments that we should use this money, that it is raining in various parts of Pennsylvania, so to speak. So, we have a decent amount of money in there. I believe it would sustain the general fund operations for around, I think, 40 to 50-ish days. But, there have been warnings from the major credit rating agencies that have said if we take money out of this account for whatever reason, it could, essentially result in a ding to our credit rating. So that's, one possible effect. And I think the big one is not having that money there could leave the state vulnerable. If something were to happen, if the state budget impasse would drag on, whatever it might be. So I think vulnerability is the big thing, whether it's the credit rating or just not having the money to fund government operations. And I think the thing to keep in mind as well is the state does have a structural budget deficit with increasing expenditures and, traditionally revenues not keeping up with that expenditure amount. So there is some financial hardship on the horizon there. And, that's, I imagine, complicating matters with the state budget as, they try to find an ultimate spend number to agree to.
Justin, are you getting any sense whether there's still urgency among the lawmakers to get this done?
I imagine they do want to get it done. I think what I've been hearing lately is that the one big beautiful bill, the major mega bill signed by President Trump into law, could have complicated matters with regard to Medicaid funding levels and other, federal spending initiatives. So I think that, complicated matters in terms of, how much the state needs to put toward Medicaid and things of that nature. So I imagine that's not an easy thing to hash out, and we'll see if that continues to drag on.
What role is political posturing playing in budget negotiations?
Oh, that's certainly I think everyone is eager to say that there's political posturing going on from the other side, right? I mean, Shapiro's been saying that for a couple months, and the Democrats have kind of taken that up, this particularly during the mass transit funding situation when that controversy was really going. There was a lot of talk, I think, that Democrats thought they could kind of capitalize on trying to pin the blame for that on the Republicans. The flip side of that is, the Republicans in both the House and the Senate have kind of balked a little bit and said, we've passed some budget bills as well, and really the Democrats haven't really played along, and there hasn't been a whole lot of urgency. Like I said, we went through the summer, and you would meet when you saw the governor or you saw anybody else, and you said, how are things going with the budget, and they make it sound like they were close, and clearly they were not. So I think there's probably, I did do an interview probably last week, and the person from the Home Care Association was talking about their struggle with, they want to increase, they want more funding so they can raise pay for the home care workers because there's this great shortage of home care workers and the state doesn't pay enough. And I think she described it as, we consider this a bipartisan failure. And that probably is pretty accurate at this point.
I would say it's worth pointing out, too, that, we're in the very preliminary stages of the 2026 gubernatorial race. And, while we have a very important judicial election coming up, we are seeing the political side of the gubernatorial race heat up. Stacey Garrity, our state treasurer, did jump into the race. And she, right now is the only major candidate on the Republican side. And she's also, I think, stepped up her communication around the state budget. She launched a loan program for certain agencies and entities affected by the state budget. So she, I think, is making her voice heard on this issue, and I don't think it's a coincidence that the governor has made reference to some political posturing on the other side, and you're getting it on both ends. But I think that race is something to keep an eye on as we talk about this impasse.
Do you think that the budget is being delayed intentionally to hurt the governor politically or to delay his ability to announce his campaign for re-election?
That's a good question. I can't say for sure, but it is interesting, all the dynamics we have at play between the race and the impasse.
Well, and I think when you look at the way the budgets have played out, particularly over the last 10 years, for as long as I've been paying attention, is since Tom Wolf became governor. I guess we could start there. The trend has been, we have a Democrat governor comes out and lays out this budget vision, and immediately the knee-jerk reaction from Republicans is always, my gosh, that's too much money. We can never afford that. And then we get a budget that's about, $1 billion less than the governor asked for. And that happens year after year. But so this year they put their foot down and said, and that seems to be where we're stuck, because all you're hearing is this notion of, well, the budget's too much. You're not hearing a whole lot of talk about specifically what everyone objects to. There's not a whole lot of, we should be doing, like we talked about before. A couple years ago, there was this blow up over school vouchers. And then we all knew they're arguing about school vouchers. This year, we knew there was months where they were arguing about transit funding. Well, that's solved now. Mm-hmm. And we're still a month later, we don't have a budget. And it's really just, it's just, as people say, well, there's like 10 things. Like, well, why? We don't know. So it is a little frustrating.
I'd like to shift our focus a little bit. Justin, you wrote about the Quinnipiac University poll that was released on October 1st. Just briefly, can you give us a thumbnail sketch of what that tells us about public perception of state politics at this time? Yeah,
right now, since we're talking about the state budget, I think something that stood out to me was that, a plurality of folks who were surveyed, I think it was around 46%, said equal sides of the legislature deserve blame. So the Democratic-controlled House, GOP-controlled Senate. And I thought that was pretty fascinating to see. It also showed Governor Josh Shapiro with fairly high approval ratings. I believe he hit 60% in this poll. And I think that was the first time he surpassed the 50% range. And it also gauged voter approval on Senators Dave McCormick and John Fetterman. And John alluded to this earlier, but I think the interesting point about Fetterman was that he seemed to receive more support and approval from Republicans than he did Democrats. And I think that, speaks to what we talked about earlier with him and his kind of Maverick-esque streak, willing to meet with President Donald Trump, willing to take, harder stances on immigration than maybe other members of his party. So that was pretty interesting to see. And it did, dive into the 2026 gubernatorial race, showing Governor Shapiro with a 55 to 39% lead over Stacey Garrity right now. And again, it's super early. Polls are just, a snapshot of a moment in time in terms of political opinion. So that could, certainly change. But I think those were some of the big takeaways that I noticed.
And I will say that Stacey Garrity mentioned this when she rolled out her little loan thing, and she was questioned on this idea of, how political is this because you are running for governor at this point. And she made the assertion, and probably with some justification, that really, a lot of the public is just not engaged in our budget impasse. It's not like the federal government where there's, every network has a little ticking clock that says, we're 2 days into a budget impasse. It's here, it's been 3 weeks and no one knows. And I think that is really one of the big things we notice as being different. It's just there's not the kind of the pressure at the state level to get a deal done here. And that's, maybe that's, I guess that kind of goes into this question of, is this going to trickle into the governor's race? Well, if people don't even realize we have a budget impasse, why would it hurt Shapiro that we have a budget impasse,
Aliya, you had written that the death of political activist Charlie Kirk in September could have an impact on young conservatives in Pennsylvania. What kind of action do you see young people taking in the last few weeks?
I think young people who were already a little conservative leaning, but weren't really sure if they want to get involved in politics, they really connected with Charlie Kirk as kind of giving them permission to be conservative and to get involved in politics. And that's what I heard when I spoke to young people at the Pennsylvania GOP fall meeting, where there was a lot of excitement around Stacey Garrity, and any young person there that I would go up to had a connection to Charlie Kirk. And it goes beyond these young involved Republicans to just young people knowing who this guy was. One of the Republicans, he was in his 20s that I spoke to, he's a teacher in a middle school. And he said that there were 7th graders coming up to him in school being like, oh, did you hear about what happened to Charlie? And how even this young, involved conservative was surprised to find out that some of his young students knew about Charlie Kirk. And so I think this guy who a lot of young people looked up to and a lot of people were activated by him being killed, I think is something that these young people really are taking note of. And I think it goes along with this national partisan narrative of just the temperature going up. And we just found that talking to young people that his death really impacted them. So I think people who already were resonating with Charlie Kirk, they are seeing this as kind of a call to action to get even more involved. And I think how widespread this effect is, we don't know, and how big of a difference it can make. But we do see already that young conservatives are seeing this as some sort of call to action.
Aliya, do you think that acts of political violence like Charlie Kirk's death have a broader impact on how citizens view their democracy and their leaders?
Yeah, I think it actually has a really big effect on how people are viewing one another, even just beyond their leaders. I think, we're hearing a lot of widespread blame on the left in response to this. And then on the left, we're hearing, they're cherry picking this instance to make generalizations, and I think just in general, when I'm in a Republican space, there's a lot of kind of looking at Democrats and leftists like they're crazy. And the same thing about Republicans in a Democratic space. And, not to mention Jersey again, but because I see so many parallels between the two states, I was at a campaign last night for the Republican Jersey candidate, and there were Democratic protesters outside. And people within the Republican event very much were like, oh, they're crazy, they want division, we're positive, we want unity. And I hear that rhetoric from both sides. And so I think whether it's from our leaders or among each others, there's definitely this massive distrust and vilification of the other side that I think can be very concerning for democracy.
Justin, you had written on another topic that other states are attempting to redraw their congressional maps in an attempt to have influence over legislative makeup. Do you see if Pennsylvania's drawing suit?
Short answer, I would say no. From the redistricting experts and advocates I've talked to, the big point that they made, which is no surprise to any of us here, is that, our legislature is so politically divided right now that, we can't even pass a state budget. We're more than 3 months out, don't have a spending plan in place. So the idea that, a divided legislature would come to agreement on a new congressional redistricting plan mid-decade is almost laughable. What we've seen so far across the nation is, it really started with Texas. President Trump, placed pressure on, Texas governor, other members of the Texas GOP to redraw the maps. That did happen. It was signed into law mid-decade, which is abnormal. Usually it happens, following the census at the beginning of the decade. And then other states have followed suit. California, led by Democratic Governor Gavin Newsom, went ahead with his own plan to try and, essentially cancel out, what Texas has done, and other states have joined the fray. But I think Senate Majority Leader Joe Pittman even threw cold water on the idea that it's a non-issue right now. And again, I think a budget comes first before we would ever even broach that subject.
While we're on the topic of Congress, Aliya, you're based in southeastern Pennsylvania. Earlier in the year, Congressman Dwight Evans announced that he's not going to seek re-election. Can you just talk briefly about who else is emerging as potential contenders for the seat?
It's a pretty busy race, and there's various members of Congress who have thrown their hat into the ring. I kind of don't want to start listing them off because I'm scared I would miss someone, and I don't want to show any perceived favoritism, but I'd say definitely look at our coverage of that race. And I think personally, I don't know who is going to kind of lead in that race, but we do know that the head of the Pennsylvania Democratic Party, the former head, he's part of the race. And so that kind of caused some shifts in the party leadership. And so regardless of who wins that race, it's having consequences on the state Democratic Party as a whole, just because as people are kind of shifting their roles in the party.
The annual March for Life rally took place in late September in Harrisburg. How much of an issue will abortion be in upcoming elections, perhaps both the judicial retentions of this year as well as next year's congressional and governor's race?
Yeah, I think the judicial retention elections for the state Supreme Court, there are 3 seats up for grabs, essentially. Voters will have the choice to vote yes or no about whether to retain 3, liberal-leaning justices, 2 additional 10-year terms. And, the state Supreme Court is Pennsylvania's high court. They rule on a lot of big issues, whether it be, voting rights, election statutes, and, abortion access. That's a big one. So, I think we're already seeing in a lot of the rhetoric around this race, Democrats framing it as, 3 pivotal elections that could potentially decide abortion access in Pennsylvania moving forward. And I imagine it'll be made an issue in 2026 as well.
Well, 2026 is really shaping up to be exciting because you will have the governor's election, which obviously then will, pivot to partisan control of the governor's mansion. But then we also have, the House is still stuck at this 102, 101 number, with Democrats clinging to their majority there. And if they lose that one seat, that would change absolutely everything, and so 2026 is going to be wild, and the abortion issue is going to be a huge part of it. That's what you talked about Charlie Kirk, and that's another thing that's really going to energize people.
John, you cover the state legislature pretty closely. We talked already about how the House and Senate are both in session this coming week. The House was just in this past week. The Senate was in a little earlier in September. What are they working on while the budget's still at a standstill?
They did pass some gun control bills this week in the House, or passed one, I guess. But yeah, not much. there's a it's as a reporter, it gets a little tough because you kind of get used into these cycles of if you go through June and they pass a budget and then there's all these code bills and then you get to go through months of trying to figure out what actually is going to happen, and it's been months of just doing pretty much the same story over and over again, saying we're stuck here. Like I said, they did pass the gun control bills with some controversy, but I don't know how big of a deal that's even going to be because it's going to go to the Senate and not going to move there either. So yeah, it's just a little frustrating right now.
Aliya, before we run out of time, you had written that the Trump administration is expected to significantly alter a slavery display at Independence Park. Can you talk a little bit about why these changes are being made?
Yeah, so it's been a little unclear and back and forth what exactly is going to happen, if anything, to this exhibit. But basically, this exhibit is very focused on slavery. And that's something that the president has said he wants there to be less of a focus on. He wants there to be more of a focus on the good things in American history. And obviously, there's been a lot of pushback to that from people who are concerned about history being rewritten. And the President's House exhibit that we were covering here in Philadelphia, it's a fairly new exhibit that, it was really put there to show this effort to say, look, like slavery was a big issue here. It wasn't all greatness in America. And so there's definitely a tension between the actual reason that exhibit's there in the first place and what Donald Trump wants to be the predominant narrative in American history. So there's definitely a tension between why that's there, what President Trump wants. I think what's going to actually happen remains to be seen. And we definitely don't know for sure what's going to happen.
Do you have any sense of whether the proposed changes to these displays, in addition to the federal shutdown and all that goes with that, will have any impact on how Philadelphia is handled for the America 250 celebration, of which they're going to be one of the significant highlights?
I think there's a lot of concern and confusion about that right now. I mean, even just the past couple of days, tourists have been confused in Philadelphia. Again, I think so much is changing so quickly all the time that we just don't know what's going to happen. But I think it's a great question. It's something to keep our eyes on.
Unfortunately, that is going to have to be the last word. Our guests have been Aliya Schneider, reporter for the Philadelphia Inquirer, John Finnerty, managing editor for CapitolWire and State Affairs, and Justin Sweitzer, managing editor for City and State PA. Thank you for watching this week's edition of Journalist Roundtable.